Levels. Hi guys, today we'll continue to consider brightness and contrast, and we'll also talk a little about toning. And all this is based on the example of a command called levels. So, the levels. You can go to the image menu, select adjustments and choose levels, or press Ctrl+L, and we'll have such a window in which we can adjust these levels. That is, move the sliders and make the image brighter or contrasting. The key aspect of this window is the histogram, which we'll now talk about in more detail. But it would be better if we go to the levels not through the top menu, but through the adjustment layers, because in this case our work on the image will be more competent. And let's get used to the best. I click on this icon that is already familiar to you and select the levels. And I got a palette of properties in which the histogram is displayed. A histogram is a kind of graph that shows the distribution of pixels by brightness. Let's take the histogram of this image and look at it in more detail. So I made such a screen of this histogram so that it would be clear to you. As you probably remember, there are 256 brightness levels in Photoshop. Well, from 0 to 255. We'll also count 0, and thus we'll get 256. At the same time, the higher the value, the lighter the tone is in the zone. The lower the value, the darker the tones are in this area. Thus, we can conditionally divide the histogram into three parts. In the left part, there are dark tones. In the middle, there are medium tones. And in the right, there are light tones. The higher this peak, the more pixels of a certain tone there are in this image. And the ability to analyze the histogram will help you to work better on the brightness and contrast of the image. On the x-axis we determine the brightness, and on the y-axis we determine the number of pixels. That is, relatively speaking, we can understand that at the leftmost point we have very few, almost zero, black pixels, and the point that shows the most average tone has the maximum number of pixels. Let's take a look at how histograms and other images look like to understand this more clearly. Let's see, for example, an image in which white color prevails. Here is a light image. And look at what the histogram looks like. It looks completely different. In the area where there are light pixels, we have the maximum height, the maximum peak, and in the area where there are black pixels, we have nothing at all. That is, we don't have a single pixel at the point that is responsible for the absolutely black color. If we now move the black slider to the right, the image will become a little darker, because it will be assumed that this point is now a black point. That is, non-black areas will become absolutely black. Of course, you can shift this gray point. Then we will have more white pixels, for example, or more black, depending on how we shift it. Let's now look at the image with a predominance of dark shades. Look, on the contrary, there we have practically non-pixels in the light areas, and in the dark areas we have quite high peaks. And now I want to show you a trick. As a rule, it is possible to significantly improve the brightness and contrast of an image if left and right sliders are moved to the place where this ascent begins. That is, we move the left slider to the beginning of this peak, and we move the right slider here, where our ascent also begins. And see how much more contrasting our image has become. We'll now turn it off for comparison, and turn it on. And the last example is an image in which the brightness is evenly distributed. And you can see how the pixels are distributed in this case. That is, we have some areas that are quite significant with a large number of gray shades, but there are practically non-absolutely black ones. Yes, and absolutely white is only the sun, probably. So, if we move a little bit here, yes, the image will become a bit contrasting. That's what we had, and that's what we got. Let's see how we can improve the image quality using the levels. And we'll discuss it on the example of black and white and color images. When we scan a black and white image of some old photo, it usually initially has some greenish yellow color or some other shade. Therefore, in order to work well with it, it is better to discolor it immediately. We go into the image menu, adjustments, desaturate, or press Shift plus Ctrl plus U. Now we can work with brightness and contrast, creating levels adjustment layer. And we see that we have no black pixels on the left side, completely, and in the right we have white pixels. And we just move the sliders to the beginning of these mountains, and that's it. It's very simple. We can also use black, white and gray eyedroppers in order to make the image contrasting in those areas that we deem necessary. Let's take the black eyedropper and click right here, and take white eyedropper and click, for example, here. And that's how much more contrasting our image has become. But pay attention, there are such stripes in the histogram. This means that there is not a single pixel in certain part of the spectrum. This contrast was achieved partly due to the fact that pixels of some brightness were simply removed from this image. Look what we had. This is a discolored image. And that's what we got. Let's look at the color image now. Everything is fairly distributed here. You can see that we have about the same number of pixels in different zones, but we can still move the sliders a little bit. The image immediately becomes brighter. We can move a middle slider, which is responsible for the gray color, a little to the right, and the image becomes, for example, more saturated and darker. Or we can move it to the left and highlight it. Sometimes we need photos with this kind of correction too. Well, I prefer to make it brighter in this case. Let's take another interesting example. Look at this interesting image. The histogram shows that gray shades prevail here, and in general the image is not very contrasting initially. But we have already said that we don't always want to increase the contrast, and sometimes such soft non-contrasting photos look very nice. And there are cases when we need to reduce the contrast. We can't move the left slider further to the left and the right slider further to the right. In this case, we can use the scale that is below, and it works in the opposite direction. That is, if I move the right slider to the right, then look what happens. I also move the second slider, and the photo becomes even more dusty. I won't use it too much now. That is, in fact, if you look at the bottom, there are output values. On the left initially it was 0. Here is what is happening. When we put the slider, for example, on the 40, then we sort of said that the darkest point will be a point with a value of 40. Not with a value of 0, but with a value of 40. And the brightest point will not be a point with a value of 255, but a point with a value, that is, we don't have absolutely black or absolutely white color in our image right now. We have already talked about eyedroppers, but now I want to draw your attention specifically to principle of work with a gray eyedropper, because it acts very interesting in color images. We take a gray eyedropper, and look, if I click on the image, then it changes its tone. If I click somewhere else now, the tone will be different. Look, I click on the stones, and here comes this shade. I click on the skirt, and the shade changes again. And with each of my click, the histogram changes. It is difficult to say in advance how exactly the color of the image will change. It is practically unpredictable, to be honest. But we can adjust the color. That is, if we catch some shade we like, and we only need to refine it, then we'll go here to RGB and select the histogram. We choose the one that we think is necessary at the moment. For example, I will choose green. And here I have a green histogram, which shows how the green color is represented here. And if I move the left slider to the right, the amount of green color decreases. That is, the left point is the maximum amount of green that is currently in this photo. Well, let's say I move it like this. And the right point is the opposite. It's the minimum amount. And if I move it to the left, then the amount of green color increases. Well, I, for example, prefer to leave some shade, like this. Among other things, we also have presets. Here we can choose the presets that are offered to us by the developers. For example, I can choose darker, and that's what I get. Or choose, for example, lighter, or we can choose brighter medium tones. That is, you can just sort it all out and choose a variant that will be optimal for you. I choose a custom one, and I will have this toning. And let's compare. That's what we had before, and that's what we got. That is, we have edited the photo in a completely opposite style. This editing is based on reducing the brightness and contrast, and on adding some colors. You can reduce the brightness even more, make it completely, for example, like this. In this lesson, I wanted to show you that with the help of histogram analysis, you can determine how many shades are in the image, which shades are missing in it, and how you can adjust these indicators. And your homework for today will be firstly to choose one of the photos, either black and white or color, and increase the brightness and contrast. And the second homework task will be to edit a photo in such a way that it looks like that. This concludes today's lesson. It was Peter Romanov and AIM School. See you next time.